Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. Joining us now is human rights activist and lawyer, Dr. Chidi Odinkalu. He's a leading voice in the human rights movement in Nigeria. He served as chairman of the country's National Human Rights Commission. He currently heads the Africa program of the Open Society Justice Initiative. And he will be discussing Nigeria.
How are you?
Yeah, great. Chidi, I see you are wearing a very interesting T-shirt, which says hashtag Nigerian Lives Matter, and with a lot of red. Well, that probably represents blood. What do you mean by Nigerian Lives Matter? And why have you chosen to wear this T-shirt?
I've been wearing this for a while now. It's my own little voice for all the people we've lost. You probably know better than I do. We've all lost count. We don't give them any names anymore. We're all quantities, you and I and everyone who's liable to be killed. And there are these vast killing fields across the country, north to south, and particularly in the northeast, northwest, and north central. And government appears to be carrying on like it doesn't matter. And people get killed for all manner of reasons, and sometimes without reason. And it's at the point where the capacity for indignation at the thought that Nigerians are being killed in these numbers no longer exists. But particularly at the level of government, it does not appear as if anyone is concerned substantially about this pattern or about what to do about it. The latest, of course, is Kaduna and what's happening there, and it's but for the curfew, 24-hour curfew declared on Kaduna Metropolis, I don't think anybody would have bothered to report that. That's really why I'm wearing this.
Well, but I mean, the government at the federal level says that, look, they've been having negotiations with Boko Haram, and that they've been doing their best possible to address all of these challenges across the country. The president even had a phone call. He made a phone call to the father of one of the aid workers who was killed. Will you say that, with all of those efforts, that government is really not doing its best?
That's precisely what I'm saying, that government is doing worse than not doing its best. Look, I'm not going to not say it's a terrible, I'm not going to say it's a terrible thing that the president called a parent who's bereaved. That's the way he should, that's doing his job. So I'm not going to congratulate him for that. But look, for the past year, the humanitarian coordination, the civic humanitarian coordination team in Borno State and in the Northeast has been having all manner of problems. Most of them cannot operate freely. Their registrations are for short term. They cannot deploy effectively because of that. They don't know whether they are going to wake up and be told they are going to be thrown out. They've been under all manner of attack from the military and from propaganda machines of the government, some of whom are claiming that because these people have done prudent investment in trying to secure accommodation for longer than a few months, they are funding the insurgency. As a result of that, the management of the humanitarian circumstances in the Northeast has deteriorated. Notwithstanding that deterioration, there's been no particular effort to try and help them get their status in place. Under that scheme of uncertainty, they now come under attack from the insurgents themselves, losing personnel. There has not been any outreach to them as we speak. Meanwhile, as at last week, the insurgents have now circulated propaganda information to the humanitarians, telling them that if they do not take some form of particular steps, they are all going to become the focus of attack. And nobody from government is reaching out to the humanitarian team to tell them what to do and how they can work together with government to address this situation. That does not seem to me to be appropriate. And in the aftermath of the killing, the latest killing of this young woman, it seems to me that the right thing for government to have done, in addition, of course, to reaching out to her family, will be to reach out to the humanitarian team in the Northeast to determine what course of action can effectively be mobilized nationally, locally, nationally, and internationally. At the moment, that is not happening, and nobody has it on the agenda.
Do you see the possibility of the Red Cross and other aid agencies, humanitarian aid agencies, pulling out of Nigeria, given what you have described?
I don't want to speculate because that could, in a situation in which things are difficult, that could make things a lot more uncomfortable. Quite clearly, that option has not been ruled out, and because it's not been ruled out, it's got to be on it's probably on the table as a possible scenario. As a manager, you and I would know that the first responsibility you've got is to your team. And if they make the determination, if they were to make the determination that they can no longer safeguard the well-being of their teams, I would imagine that that could well be a possibility. At the moment, however, my hope is that there is still room for government at the highest levels with the humanitarians in the Northeast to work together to avert that possibility. And there's good reason why we must do that. The reach of government is fairly limited in the Northeast to the metropolitan capitals. Beyond that, particularly in Borno and Yobe, it's quite limited. Much of the provisioning that people get on a day-to-day basis is from the humanitarian agencies. There's not been a lot of farming in that part of the country this year. And without the humanitarian agencies, there will be a heck of a lot of hunger. The estimates are that somewhere between 4 to 5 million people are at risk of hunger in that part of Nigeria. Our strategic grain reserves are depleted to entirely empty. If those people were to leave, we would have a humanitarian catastrophe. We have every reason to move to avoid that.
You were chairman of the National Human Rights Commission for 4 years. Now, will you say that the government is right because in spite of they've become worse?
Look, I start from the premise that there are no perfect human rights situations. It's always work in progress. But even within that framework, I would score the current administration beneath abysmal. In 2015, the situation in the Northeast was bad. But at least we knew where we were. It was the Northeast. Since then, the mass killings have extended to the Northwest and to the North Central. That cannot be acceptable. And indeed, we've reached the crossover point at which killings in the North Central and now the Northwest have outstripped killings in the Northeast. So you could start by giving government some credit for bringing the situation in the Northeast under control. Comparatively, killings in the Northeast have gone down relative to what they were, say, in 2014, where I think there was the optimal spike in killings over there. But whatever we've gained in the Northeast appears to have been lost in the Northwest and the North Central, which indeed could call into question the strategy in the Northeast, which appears to have been a strategy of displacement. Some of the evidence appears to suggest, and I want to be careful in how I frame this, that some of the operatives displaced from the Northeast have simply moved theaters to new frontiers. There's also been displacement with the herds and pastoralists who have moved from the Northeast to some other parts of the country. And so, as a result of that, new tensions have intensified in other parts of the country, which has got us to where we were. None of this was particularly such that we could not have foreseen them. So the question must be, why did we not, and why have we not taken the steps we should have to ensure that these did not come to where we are now. And I must say that it's not just about the federal government alone, because security provisioning, which, by the way, our constitution says is the first responsibility of government, should be a shared responsibility between the federal and state governments. I think, for instance, a governor like that of Benue State has been entirely irresponsible. I think the Plateau State governor has not performed particularly better. I think the Kaduna State governor has been incendiary in a place that needs calming influence. And there's more than enough irresponsibility to go around. But I should also say that somebody like the Vice President, Professor Shibajo, has gone beyond the call of duty in some of the stuff that I've seen, in some of the evidence that I've seen. So I don't want to generalize as such. But the president has not been present. The president has not provided leadership, and that is my honest opinion.
Well, in specific terms, in terms of strategy, what do you think can be done differently?
Look, I'm not the person Nigerians cast a vote for. Nigerians cast a vote for a president. He's not been present, and he's not presided. So, first item on the strategy agenda, can the president be present? Can the president preside? Since he was elected, President Buhari has only addressed Nigerians once, and I mean once, in a media conversation. He doesn't talk to us. He talks at us when he is outside Nigeria. He's quite comfortable talking to white people in white country. Elected him, who voted for him. Perhaps he could become a little humbler and understand that we actually are his bosses and he owes us some responsibility and accountability. If he could begin to talk to us and take us seriously, maybe we could all work on this together. And he can also understand, I mean, again, since President Buhari was elected in 2015 or sworn in, he has only awarded 2 national honors I'm aware of. One to the late Moshood Abiola and the other to Babagana Kingibe. So President Buhari has a monopoly of virtue. There is no Nigerian since 2015 who has been worth honoring. It is these kinds of things that have made him somewhat lonely and lonesome in the leadership forest. And he's lost, quite frankly. In my view, he doesn't seem to know exactly what he's got to do. Without that, no recommendation or suggestion anyone can make will be much use. That is what I fear is the case.
But he wants a second term in office, and his handlers are saying that he deserves a second term to be able to consolidate on some of his achievements. But here you are saying that he's been an absent-minded president. Do you think he deserves a second term?
That's for Nigerians to decide. It's not for me. I
just want your opinion.
Is one vote, which he's got a legal right. He's got a constitutional right to run, and Nigerians have got a constitutional right to decide that question. In my view, the only thing I ask for is a level playing field. That, for me, is more important than anybody's prognostication, anybody's opinion. I couldn't be bothered about anybody's opinion as to whether or not President Buhari deserves or doesn't deserve a second term. The question is, can INEC be trusted to deliver a fair ballot? That, for me, is the dispositive question. And in the aftermath of Osun, everybody has a responsibility to hold INEC's feet to fire and make sure we don't repeat that disgrace, because the APC lost Osun and somehow they manufactured a result that should not have happened. I don't support any party, Ruben, as you probably well know. I had enough problems with you guys when you were in power. For me, this country is bigger than any one of us. And cynicisms like the release of Nnamdi Kanu and handing him his passport to go to Israel and continue to do this incendiary nonsense he's doing just cast aspersions and cast a doubt as to whether there are enough people who believe that this country is worth fighting for.
Well, let me rephrase the earlier question. Will you vote for President Buhari?
I have never voted for a soldier. I will not vote for a soldier while I'm alive. I think soldiers belong in the barracks. That's my personal view. But look, that is not the issue at stake. In 2015, I did not have a vote. I was the chair of the National Human Rights Commission, and in my view, I should not have voted. I did not vote. In 2011, I was outside the country. I did not vote. As an ideological personal view, I think soldiers have done enough damage to our country. I did not support President Obasanjo. I don't support soldiers. That is my personal view, and it's ideological. But I support the Federal Republic of Nigeria. I also do think that we have an opportunity to look for a different face and a different generation to lead the country. If not in 2019, maybe in 2023. But we've got to start working for a kind of different generation that can give us a different shot at saving this country.
Well, I mean, you already knocked President Buhari's claims to having done a lot in the area of managing the country's security situation. How about the fight against corruption? I mean, both President Buhari and its assistants...
That's discredited, in my view.
Excuse me? You said?
The fight against corruption is discredited, in my view.
How?
Quite clearly it's discredited. I don't think the government is serious about it. In every way possible, they've gone out of their way to discredit it. And I mean, the fact that the government still fails to publish the report of the Shibajo panel that investigated the former Secretary to the Government of the Federation and the former Director General of the National Intelligence Agency is itself sufficient evidence, in my view. But it's not just that. They then went on ahead to release that $43 or $47 million back to the NIA without telling anybody why or how and under what circumstances they did that. There have been rather weighty allegations against pretty much everybody in the administration, apart from the president and the vice president. None of those have been investigated. And then there is this there's this scandal. Actually, that gives scandal a bad name when you think about it, of this guy at the National Health Insurance Service who somehow believes that he's superior to God. He will not listen to his minister. He will not listen to his governing council. He will not listen to anybody. And somehow he's carrying on like the country is dispensable for his sake. All of that is happening under the watch of a president who claims to be fighting corruption. That's exactly the same administration that went to destroy judges in their residences at night, arresting 7 of them, none of whom has been convicted, none of whom could ever be convicted because the evidence was not in existence. And the leader, the manager of the State Security Service who masterminded that has been fired in circumstances that no one can understand, but no one wants to bring him to legal accountability. When you look at all of that, you wonder what exactly the fight against corruption is about. Let me be clear. I believe in the 11th commandment, thou shalt not be caught. And so I don't give anybody any partisan alibi. It's not enough that to say, I'm in PDP and they're coming after me. No. But if you're good, by all means, please prosecute all the PDP people, but please also prosecute all the APC people. That's all I ask. And I don't think that's asking for too much. But when you don't do that in an even-handed manner, what you do is to discredit the fight against corruption. And that's exactly what the military has done since 1966. It has not changed. The script remains the same.
Well, earlier on, you referred to the 2019 elections. What role should the civil society play in that election? Because it looks like, even civil society in Nigeria has, copped out, has sold out, and it's not as viral as it was, say, compared to what we had in your days with the Civil Liberties Organization and other groups.
Sadly, I tend to agree with you there. I think my views are personal to me and are not particularly liked by my colleagues in civil society. But there are capacity issues and there are credibility issues. The capacity issues are skill-based. Civil society could quite clearly, in my view, capacitate itself a lot more grow skills to be a lot more competitive, because fighting or working under an administration with electoral credibility is a lot more difficult than fighting or advocating against the military. The skills you need under the military are essentially skills of screaming and shouting, skills of showing up. But you've got a lot more subtlety and content required when you go up against an administration with electoral credibility. And you need a lot more staying power. That's been a little more difficult achieving under the current dispensation with civil society. The second thing, in my view, is the credibility issue, which is probably steeper than the capacity issue. Civil society, again, in my personal opinion, took partisan sides in the 2015 election. Most people in civil society, I would argue, were explicitly in support of one platform. When that platform won through, they decided to go on holiday, expecting, in some cases, if not many cases, political appointments of different kinds. As a result, the government took over 6 months or nearly 6 months to appoint a cabinet, and very few people found anything wrong with that. They appointed a rather predictable cabinet. Very few people found nothing wrong with that. And then we went into a recession that was avoidable. Very few people found nothing wrong with that. By the time civil society began to discover its voice and discover that nothing had changed, and much that could be said to have changed had changed for the worse, they had bled credibility to the point of no return. And we're now at the point where it needs its voice, to find its voice to be able to play an effective role in 2019, and that credibility deficit is still gaping and gasping. And how it's recovered, I don't know, but if civil society does not recover that credibility in time for 2019, that could well be an election cycle wasted.
But will you say, with all of this, that the social media in Nigeria has managed to fill a certain gap?
I hope so. I mean, we all participate in that space in some form. You probably more effectively than some of us. I find the social media interesting as a source of intelligence. It's fascinating. So there's a heck of a lot of open source intelligence gathering going on social media, quite apart, of course, from other forms of algorithmic intelligence. I'm not overly excited about its content for obvious reasons. There's a lot of yaboo and abuse and all of that. People in search of influence without responsibility on social media. I also am somewhat skeptical, not too sanguine about a situation in which organized civil society, organized trade unions, political parties all cop out in favor of social media, because voting does not happen on social media. Digital communities are no replacement for human communities. And at the moment, what we seem to have done is that, for instance, the major opposition parties, particularly the PDP, has copped out on its responsibility and wants, in my opinion, to cash in on criticism from social media on power. I don't think that's right. The ruling party on its own is also not particularly better organized, and none of the other major parties as such are filling that gap. There is a huge gap of civic and political leadership and responsibility, and social media is not going to fill that. I do think social media does have a huge role to play, but I don't think it is a substitute for leadership and political and civic responsibility. It's only a complement and a platform.
Well, let's leave Nigeria for a moment and then look at what is happening in Africa. Tomorrow, the African Peoples and Human Rights Council is having a conference beginning tomorrow in Banjul to look at the state of human rights in Africa. What will be your assessment of the human rights situation in Africa generally?
We're at an interesting intersection. Yes, indeed, the Commission convenes for its 63rd ordinary session. But it's also at a point in which domestic political agendas are constraining its space. Across the continent, as you probably are aware, civic space is very constrained. Before I came on your show, you were discussing Cameroon, an 85-year-old who's just won a seventh 7-year term with over 71% of the ballot allocated to him in a vote in which less than 30% of the population actually participated, and in which 2 regions of 10 in the country did not at all vote. In Uganda, you see what is happening. President Museveni has procured all manner of shenanigans in order to keep himself perpetually in power, just as has happened in Rwanda, just as has happened in Burundi. President Kabila wants to do a Putin in the DRC. And you see what happened in the Zimbabwean elections. Across the continent, and of course in Egypt, the civic sector is under emergency, and most of its leaders are either in prison or under house arrest. That really is a reflection of what's happening across the continent. The one exception, it seems, to all of this rather negative trend is Ethiopia, where the new Prime Minister Abiy, 41 years old that he is, appears to be giving Ethiopia a new lease of life. And you can see what's happening with that. Ethiopia's economy is galloping. It's at the moment the fastest growing economy in Africa. The people have been unlocked, and there's a huge burst of enthusiasm about Ethiopia's possibilities. That's what happens when politics offers people a chance. And really, that's what's likely to be on the agenda at the 63rd ordinary session of the African Commission. How do you unlock civic possibilities in order to transform Africa's possibilities? And how quickly and swiftly can we do that? Can we do that across a vast enough footprint to make an impression on the continent? Because if we don't, Africa is the continent with the largest youth bulge in the world. It's the continent that is growing at the fastest pace. If we don't do that, we could end up with demand outstripping supply and the continent eating itself up.
Yeah, one of the issues on the table in the Banjul summit is the issue of the decriminalization of petty offenses. And, you know, I was attracted by that. How do you decriminalize petty offenses? And what really is the problem that this has become an issue for human rights consideration?
Let me try and illustrate that. The Commission has, in fact, adopted a set of soft law standards on the decriminalization of petty offenses. But a lot of people actually get wasted in the country, from imprisonment to long detention to, in fact, extrajudicial executions as a result of petty offenses. Anything from criminalization of civil debt to such colonial crimes as wandering and malingering. And so, you see, a lot of that is about criminalizing poverty. If you, Dr. Bati, went out to work in the evening, you are a big man, a well-known face, it's called taking a stroll, you are exercising. Now, if your driver, who is presumably not as famous as you are, or as educated or as articulate, went to do exactly the same thing at the same time, he could be arrested for the petty crime of wandering. And although that crime is a misdemeanor punishable with about 1 year imprisonment or less, he could end up in detention because he does not have money to pay a bribe or hire a lawyer or something of the sort. And when he ends up in police cell in detention, he could be processed to court, committed to jail, and that is his life ruined. He could even suffer a worse fate, get into an altercation with the police because his skills could presumably be limited, and they waste him or shoot him, and he dies as a result of extrajudicial killing. That's the kind of consequence that could come as a result of these so-called petty offenses. And that's why it is a major cause for many of us who work on human rights issues across the continent that we should actually make a policy of removing them from the law books.
But how much impact do these both regional and continental, commissions, either on human rights or on justice or other issues, how much impact do they have? I mean, take the example of Nigeria, where the Nigerian government, under President Buhari's watch, has routinely ignored the ECOWAS court and has consistently violated the Charter on African and Human People's Rights.
I will stop short at the moment of accusing the Nigerian government of routinely ignoring the ECOWAS court. First of all, Nigeria hosts the ECOWAS court. It sits here in Abuja. Nigeria has always had a judge, at least, on the panel of the ECOWAS court. And at the moment, the Nigerian judge is Dupe Atoki, who used, by the way, to be the chairperson of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And before and thereafter was the Director General of the Consumer Protection Council. The reality is that implementation of judgments or decisions in international law, and the ECOWAS court is an international court and tribunal, does take a little bit of time. If you recall, the Bakassi decision of the International Court of Justice was reached in 2002. As we speak, it is still in implementation. Implementation has not yet been completed. And for instance, boundary demarcation on the basis of the Bakassi decision on the eastern frontiers of Nigeria from Cameroon to Chad border is still ongoing. And that's nearly 16 years after that decision was taken. So that's really the reality of international law and the way it works. And so coming back to your chapeau, though, the top of your question as to impact. Impact, of course, unfolds over time, and over time implementation also does take place. A heck of a lot has happened on the back of the work of these regional courts and tribunals. If you remember, in 1992, I believe, Justice Okadibo sentenced, in 1991, Justice Okadibo sentenced Zamani Lekwot to death over the second Kafanchan crisis, which had occurred earlier in that year, as a result of which President Babangida set up the Miscellaneous Offences Tribunal, which tried General Zamani Lekwot. If there had not been an African Commission on Human and People's Rights, General Lekwot would have been dead. It was the commission that saved his life. I represented personally the estate of a Burkinabe journalist who was assassinated in 1998, Norbert Zongo. And we finally won that case against Burkina Faso in 2015. It was on the back of two international decisions that what happened in Burkina Faso happened. One was the struggles of Genevieve, who was Norbert Zongo's widow. The other was the struggles of Thomas Sankara's widow. Those two widows inspired the change in Burkina Faso with two cases. One that went to the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations for the rectification of the death certificate of Thomas Sankara. After Sankara was killed, his best friend, Blaise Compaoré, who organized for him to be shot, got issued a death certificate which said that he died in his sleep. Sankara's widow sued up until the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations to make sure that the records reflected that her husband was murdered. And Genevieve sued to make sure that her husband's death was vindicated. Together, they kept the hope for change alive in Burkina Faso, which led ultimately to the abdication under pressure by President Compaoré. I'm just illustrating for you how the connection happens between the work of international human rights courts and tribunals and domestic advocacy. It may take a while, but it does happen.
Well, I mean, just before you go, I want to take you back to something you've already addressed, citing the example of Cameroon. You did a book recently with Aisha Oshori, Too Good to Die, The Myth of the Indispensable Man. Isn't it the case that some persons in history are possibly, probably, indispensable, truly, as leaders?
There are no indispensable people. The good Lord made us, all of us, biodegradable for a reason, that hopefully the best of us should not be behind us, but in front of us. And in that, because the best of us is always in front of us and not behind us, we cannot wallow in the myth of indispensability. And really, that's why we wrote the book, to illustrate an arc, a trajectory of our own national story in which some people have tried, it's not just some particular individuals, but also an institution, the military, has tried to posit itself as indispensable. And in so doing, they've subjected us to a situation that no country actually should be in. And unless we bust that myth of indispensability and rediscover our mutual benefits to one another as citizens of a country in which we all deserve one another together, we will not be able to craft a country that deserves the best of its people. And this country is a tremendous country. I always like to say that. Nigerians are tremendous people. The only problem we have is that we've had a succession of leaders who don't deserve our people.
Well, thank you very much, Chidi Odinkalu, for coming to the morning show. Thank you very much. This has been a really interesting conversation. Thank you. That's all from Dr. Odinkalu. Up next, the founder of ArtX Lagos, the first international art fair in West Africa, Tukini Pistasai, will be here to discuss contemporary art from Africa and its diaspora. We'll be right back.
There is nothing as symbolic as a door. It shuts to protect you and opens to give you much more. Everyone wants to succeed. There is nothing as symbolic as a door.